Welcome to the Coyote Creek Visitors Center virtual BioBlitz. We're really happy that you're able to join us tonight for this webinar. The Coyote Creek Visitors Center is just north of Anderson Dam and Morgan Hill, and it's adjacent to Coyote Creek. This new visitor center is a wonderful spot to rest during a hike or bike ride and to learn more about the nature outside the center. At this virtual BioBlitz, you'll see nature in an intimate way. Basically, you're looking at all living things, the biota, over a period of time, the Blitz. This tour at the area surrounding Coyote Creek Visitor Center and southern end of Coyote Creek Parkway is a virtual deep dive nature walk. We have 3 topics to share with you, showcasing bugs, plants, aquatic creatures, and more. We'll also have 2 question and answer sessions. Hi, my name is Deb Kramer, and I'm the founder of Keep Coyote Creek Beautiful. And for over the past 6 years, I've been working along the Coyote Creek, developing programs to engage and build community around the creek. Our vision is for a vibrant Coyote Creek with clean waters, abundant wildlife, and natural beauty for all to enjoy. We host activities that encourage recreation. We also do educational activities, and we take action such as cleaning our creeks and providing advocacy for a healthy creek. I'd like to turn it over to Hannah Cunningham from Grassroots Ecology now.
Hi everyone, great to be here. I'm Hannah. I'm the Naturalist Programs Coordinator at Grassroots Ecology. You'll meet my coworker Claire in just a minute. A little bit about our organization. Grassroots Ecology is a nonprofit organization working primarily on the peninsula and South Bay to restore local ecosystems. We have 25 plus sites, parks and preserves on creeks and open spaces where we do habitat restoration, and we also do a lot of environmental education. We have our naturalist and education programs like our naturalist walks and of course these BioBlitzes. We've been partnering with Keep Coyote Creek Beautiful for the past year on these events, both virtual and in person, and been having a really great time being out in the field with them, and really great to have this last one with y'all tonight. So we're happy to be here and happy to talk to everybody. A couple things about Zoom. We all are pretty familiar by now about how this goes, but some of our suggestions are if you keep yourself on speaker view, then that way you'll, especially with the videos, you'll be able to see everything well. If you don't mind keeping yourself on mute while the videos are playing, that would be great. But of course, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll either answer them in line in the chat or bring them up in the Q&A after the videos. And during the Q&A, we'll also invite you to just speak up and raise your hand and ask your questions yourself. Turn it back to you, Deb.
Great, thanks so much, Hannah. Glad that we're able to do our partnership together. And I would like to, at this time, go ahead and share some images. So as Hannah said, this has been a partnership with Keep Coyote Creek Beautiful and Grassroots Ecology, and we've been really happy to work together. And we also were funded in part by the Open Space Authority of Santa Clara Valley and the Santa Clara County Parks, which we're so grateful to have. To orient you, I wanted to share this Coyote Creek map. So the headwaters of Coyote Creek is actually at the Henrico State Park area. The water flows through a backwards J into Anderson Lake and past the Coyote Creek Visitor Center, down through downtown San Jose, into Milpitas, and finally out through into San Francisco Bay. It's a 64-mile long creek and the largest watershed in the South Bay. The Coyote Creek Visitor Center at Anderson Lake County Park sits near the end of the Coyote Creek Parkway. The center reopened in April of 2017 after a major upgrade. It contains an interpretive display, inside, picnic tables, water fountains, and bathrooms with running water on site. And many visitors include trail users and cyclists. Additionally, there's a 1.5-mile nature trail that starts at the center where the visitor center is. It crosses the creek and takes you on a loop past an old barn and English walnut orchard, which we'll talk about briefly. Here you can see the inside of the visitor center. It is open on the weekends, and they are practicing COVID safe rules where a limited number of people are allowed on site at any given time. One of the things you may have heard is about the Anderson Reservoir drawdown and seismic stability effort. So right now, there was a 2011 study about the seismic stability and that it may not meet a 7.25 earthquake. So in 2016, the Valley Water Board had a extensive retrofit planned. And just a year ago, in February, the Federal Energy Emergency Commission issued the order to draw down water and to start the project. And this is regarding the 2017 Oroville Dam, which had a break in it. So here you can see the reservoir at dead pool, which means that there's pretty much a drawdown to 3% of its capacity, but it's still large, like Stevens Creek Reservoir. This project includes replacing the spillway, which is supposed to be finished next year, and reconstruction of the embankment that goes down into Coyote Creek. So on July 7th, 2021, Valley Water held a groundbreaking ceremony, and it's expected to be completed at 2032 and cost $616 million. So now I'd like to introduce our three presenters who participated in doing this on-site web video so that we could have this webinar. First is Merav Vonshak. She's a community science organizer leading public events and programs in the South Bay. She organizes BioBlitz events and leads hikes and iNaturalist workshops in collaboration with many organizations. She also leads community science programs, such as the Pacific Newt Roadkill Survey and the Jasper Ridge Ant Survey. She founded BioBlitz.club, a home for community science events in the South Bay. She has a BA in biology, a master's in science and ecology, and a PhD in zoology. Next is Claire Elliott, who is a senior ecologist with Grassroots Ecology, where she teaches about and restores nature. Claire teaches an annual California Naturalist class and water pollution prevention classes in schools. Prior to joining Grassroots Ecology in 2006, Claire worked for Stevens and Permanente Creek Watershed Council, Hidden Villa, and did some consulting. She has a BS in biology from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, 1 year of freshwater ecology studies at the University of Uppsala, Sweden, and an MS in environmental engineering and science from Stanford. Colter Cook is the interpretive coordinator for Keep Coyote Creek Beautiful, where he provides classroom education, leads creek and trail cleanups, and conducts outreach at public events. He also is an environmental educator at Walden West. Prior to joining KCCB, he worked at the Youth Science Institute, the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge. He has a BS in environmental science from Chico and is a certified national interpreter. So the first video that we'll be sharing with you is on aquatic creatures, immediately followed by hidden creatures, and then we'll have a Q&A period.
Okay, so I have a few things that I scooped here from the creek behind me. The first one is a Mayfly Lava. So mayflies are little insects. The lava is aquatic, lives in the water, and actually has gills. So let's see if you can see the gills on the side of the abdomen of the mayfly. Whoops. Yeah, it will actually need to stop for that, so we'll see. But anyway, this is the lava. The adult, on the other hand, is a flying insect. We also have some crustaceans like we had before. So this is an amphibird of some sort. You can identify them later using our little guide. And then we have water boatmen here that we had before. We have a fish. We'll look at the fish in a minute. And what else?
Did you get a snail?
Yeah, we have a tiny snail here, which actually looks like the New Zealand mud snail, which is a highly invasive species that we've seen spreading around in this area in the past couple of years. And will probably take over at some point if the conditions are right. They don't lay eggs, this species. They actually give live birth, which is interesting. So each snail should have tiny snails inside, and that's the best way to identify them. And let's see if we can get the fish out.
Pretty good size, judging
Yeah, it's
from
a
your
nice sized
spoon.
fish. I'm not sure if it'll fit my spoon. Yeah, so just trying to get quick photos for ID, and then we can put them back.
We've collected a sample from Coyote Creek with the D-net, and our first 4 organisms we found, 2 of them in very high number, are the black flies and the tiny little baited mayflies, and an isopod, which we learned last time we were here is not a native isopod. We'll get a close-up on him. It's related to the pill bugs. And I'm curious if these creatures, he's rolling up like the pill bugs do, if they're coming in with the water from San Luis Reservoir, because the flow here is augmented significantly with water from the delta that's pumped up to San Luis Reservoir. The black flies are really fun. They're like little bowling pins, I think of them as. They've got a rounded end that they stick to the rock with. The reason we found a lot of them right where I sampled is because there's flowing water over rocks, and they're filter feeders, so they stick to those rocks and wait for things to come to them with their little, they look like eyelashes on their head that they collect food particles with to eat. The funny thing is there's actually a black fly who's fixed himself to this damselfly. It was on his leg, and it looks like he's moved to his tail here. So I thought there was maybe a parasite on the poor damselfly when I first saw him, but it's just a black fly looking for a surface to be on. So the damselfly is related to dragonflies. You can tell the adults apart because they hold their wings flat. The larvae, you can tell the difference because the gills are on these plates sticking off the back. So they're kind of flat tails. I'll get some close-ups of him to show you. Both of them are predators, and they have mouth parts that come across their faces like this as larvae, and oops, you can see. So their mouth parts are like this, and if you pull very gently, you can open them up and see how they can open and close like this. And I've actually seen a picture of a large dragonfly with a fish that it's caught. So that's kind of turning the tables and getting the bugs to eat the fish. They're also the dragonflies are really interesting because their gills are up their abdomens. And so they actually squirt water, they suck water in to get the oxygen out of it in their gills. But then when they squirt it out, they jet propulse through the water. So if you get a chance to watch a dragonfly scooting through the water, it's breathing and moving at the same time, which I think is very fascinating.
So yeah, I'm looking under rocks, because often you could find all sorts of macroinvertebrates that live in the creek. Oh, finally found something. Okay, so this is a rock from the creek, and you can see the little crawling things here. Okay, these are different crustaceans, and we can put them over a white background in a second so you get a better look, but you can see them crawling. So this is like a roly-poly but underwater. It's an aquatic crustacean. Now it's on its back. Ooh, look at that. Okay. So these are not the largest crustaceans we have living here. This is a little piece of crayfish that lives in the creek. It's a non-native crayfish. Just like the little crustaceans, which are actually also non-native, probably. This is there are two different species of crayfish that live here, and they get much bigger than this. This is just a claw, but the crayfish itself is probably this big, and they can get even slightly larger. So it's a pretty large animal, and you see, even though it's a non-native, some of the native species would eat it. You can see kingfisher, the awesome birds, eating these. And then some of the mammals that live by the creek would eat them as well. So you can find them in the scat. They're so red and obvious. Something we always find in all our creeks and ponds and everywhere you could find water is this non-native clam. If you get closer, you actually see them everywhere. This is called the Asian clam, and it's well spread in the entire Bay area, at least the South Bay. But it's very common. They get a bit larger than this. They have two paws connected. When the creek dried out this summer, you could see thousands of them lining the creek bed. They couldn't survive without water. This area probably still has some live ones, as I think it was running the whole time, but if you'll go downstream from here where the creek is dry, you'll still see lots of dead ones. I'm going to take some photos with my underwater camera because some of these creatures are not that easy to catch, and also it might be interesting to see what they look like in their natural environment on my spoon. Or we could do both. So I'll take my little camera into the water, and I can see tiny moving dots here, and these are water boatmen. It's a true bug that is adapted to living in freshwater habitat like this creek. This is a water boatman. It's a true bug. This is, I think, the adult, but both the adult and the nymph, the young ones, live underwater, but the adults also has wings, so they can fly. If the little pond where they live dries out, they can always go somewhere else to lay their eggs.
Busy little buddy.
Yeah, they're not the easiest to photograph because they're too busy.
So the baited mayfly is one of the more tolerant, of the intolerant order of insects, the Ephemeroptera. So when we want to figure out what the quality of water is in a creek, sometimes we can do a bioassessment where we look for three orders of insects: the Ephemeroptera, the mayflies, Plecoptera, the stoneflies, and Trichoptera, the caddisflies. So the mayflies are fairly pollution intolerant, but these guys, the baited mayflies, are the most tolerant of that intolerant group. So you find them in water that's still not that great quality. I think it's because they're very mobile and they can find a better spot if there's a place with low dissolved oxygen. But we'll get a close-up on them because they're very tiny ones. A little tiny springtail has hopped into our water, and I can't get him out, but we'll also get a little picture of him. That's a soil organism that hopped in out of the dirt. So between the critters we found here, I'd say the water quality here is probably not stellar. It's getting colder and more oxygenated, so it's supporting the mayflies, but they're all fairly pollution tolerant organisms.
Okay, next we'll be seeing exploring hidden worlds. And we'll have a time for questions after this video.
Here in Anderson Lake County Park, there's plenty of opportunities for birding. Take this tree, for example. To a passerby, it might just look like an old dead tree, who cares? But to a bird, say like a black phoebe, this tree is a wonderful place to perch upon and look out for flies and other flying insects. So here we have a ground squirrel hole. I can tell because the shape of the burrow, and also there's some ground squirrel scat right here at the entrance. The cool thing about ground squirrels is that they create habitat for other wildlife. So they have really good limbs for digging and clawing and moving dirt. Some other creatures, not so much, even though they do depend on burrows. So some examples are salamanders, snakes, and sometimes even burrowing owls. So here I found another dead tree, and it has some nice cavities in it. So a dead tree like this can have many different functions for the birds that live in this area. For example, a dead tree like this might make a great granary for an acorn woodpecker, a place for it to store its acorns. And those divots, those crevices they create, then go on to get bigger and bigger, and eventually they get pretty large, and animals, birds like the oak titmouse might be able to nest in there because they are cavity nesters. Whenever you're in a park like this, it's easy to miss those things that are just out of sight.
So I'm shaking the Coastline Oak to see what kind of insects I can find, because when you look at the tree you don't see much, but there are actually many different insects that live on the tree. Not just inside galls, but there are many different free-living organisms, like these winter ants or small honeypot ants. They're foraging on the tree looking for food. And then there are all sorts of tiny, tiny, tiny moving dots. Okay, we can use a macro lens to get a bit closer and take a closer look at them. But this is what makes the Coastline Oak so wonderful, because there's so many insects that can visit. So you can see that this moss is bright and green because the moss turns kind of grayish green when it's very dry. This one probably got some good dew, morning dew or something, and it's bright green. Look at that. It's very good. And I think these might be two different species here. I mean, there are very few moss experts, unfortunately. Not too many people can identify them. But to me, they look different. It might be the same one. There's an elongated one, and then this one looks more like stars. And what I'll do is I'll take some photos, and hopefully someone who knows moss will be able to help us identify them. Oh, and you know, once you start looking, you find other things. There's a tiny mite here, tiny white mite, walking on this leaf. So the leaf litter is an incredible habitat for many different invertebrates. And then this is actually an oak gall. Looks like a little ball, but this is the live oak bud gall. They're very hard like this, and they will drop, here's another one, from the tree at some point. They didn't hatch yet, so this is probably part of the natural life cycle.
So here's an example of some moss that hasn't received enough of the moisture in the air or rain. See that it's already starting to dry out. In fact, there's a very dry patch right there.
But the other thing that is really interesting here are the different lichens you could find on this buckeye. So there are at least two different kinds. Oh, and more. These are like really cute. They look like a little alien city or something. Like how cool it is. So this is one species. There's a different one right here. Look at that. Through the magnifying glass on my macro lens, you could see the little details here. Isn't that incredible? Can get even closer. I think these are super cute. And then here's a different kind, completely different. So I'm looking under a little log, just a tiny log here in the field. And the first thing I saw was these two beautiful slender salamanders. This is called California slender salamander. They're very small. Look at that compared to my hand.
Yeah.
They're really tiny creatures. They kind of look like a worm with eyes and legs. Tiny, tiny legs. This is actually a very long individual. The longer one was really large for this species. And then, but that's the only thing. Not the only thing, sorry. There is a young Jerusalem cricket right here. Ooh, that's its butt. Come out, please, gently. Okay, so this is a Jerusalem cricket.
Mm-hmm.
And they can get very large. It's also called potato bug and other things. And then there are lots of ants here. This is called banana cream pie ant or odorous house ant. It's one of our native ants that you might actually get in your kitchen as well. It's a pretty cool species. And then there's a wood louse. Yeah, there's one here and another one there. Okay. And they all share this space. Oh, and a spider, look at that. It's a wolf spider. And it's gone.
Okay, welcome back everyone. Just wanted to offer up opportunities for people to pose questions to any of our panelists who participated, Merav, Claire, or Colter. Raise your hand and Hannah will allow you to ask your question.
We've got a couple questions right now that are in the chat. One is, how hard is it to get the water boatment down to species? Imagine it might be difficult, but Claire, Marav, Colter.
Yeah, so unfortunately we can't identify the species, at least not using photos. I'm not sure what would be the identifying characteristics, but on iNaturalist, I post all my photos on iNaturalist, and we get them identified to subfamily. There's a great expert for aquatic insects, but he can't identify them from pictures, and other people don't even try. So it's difficult to identify them.
Nice. Sometimes it's about knowing that expert on iNaturalist and seeing if they
Yeah,
help you out.
so I mean, I know them online and they can't identify it. So I wonder if you need very specific photos, or sometimes you need, you know, like when we try and identify mushrooms, you have to take like a side view, sometimes the top, and then underneath the mushroom, and you have to pull it out of the ground. You know, so there are a few things you need, and even then, you can't always identify them, but sometimes you'll have enough information. So I wonder what kind of information is needed here that we don't have.
Totally, yeah. Another question for you, Marav, what macro lens do you use or recommend for an iPhone?
Oh, I highly recommend these lenses, even though it's very difficult to get them now because they stopped making them. And I don't know why. Everyone I know wants to have one or has one. So anyway, this is called Shift Cam. I'll write their names. There are two different kinds that I use. When I break one, I buy the other one. But I think it's fantastic. It has two different macro lenses and the two other are important, but it's great.
The quality you get is really awesome.
I've purchased a shift cam, even though it's not the shifting kind. I really still like it. You have to thread it on, which is just another step, and that means you have to carry it in your pocket somewhere else. But it does do a good job of getting clear images at 10x.
All right. Karan has a question. How do you tell the difference between a woodlouse and a roly-poly?
Okay, another bug question. So an oak woodlouse can't roll. I don't know if do we have a slide where we see them one next to that, or maybe not. So the woodlouse cannot roll into a ball like a roly-poly, and the shape is a bit different. It looks like they have two little tails. They're more like elongated. Other than a roly-poly, it looks like a little tank, and you could imagine that it could complete itself into a ball. I'm not sure that's very useful, but when you see them one next to the other, I think that's helpful. If you just see one, sometimes it's difficult to tell if it's which one it is, but if you see both, then I think it's easier.
I'm interested to learn if the woodlouse is another common name for the sow bug, which is a common
Yeah, I
name
think
for the
so.
ones.
Yeah.
The sow bugs, their bodies in cross section flare out on the side.
Yeah.
Unlike the others are like a school bus; they come straight down, and those are the ones that can roll up. But the ones that flare out, I learned as sow bug. Of course, that's not the
it's the same
scientific
thing.
name.
And they're all isopods. They're all land crustaceans that live here under rocks, and many of them are non-native, just like the aquatic ones.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a question from Derek. What is the best thing to do with invasive species? I'm gonna open it up to you, Derek, if you'd like to clarify that a little bit for the ecologists, or I maybe have lost the context for that. So if you would like to clarify, that'd be great. That's okay. Maybe Claire or Merav, do you know, I didn't see when this question came in, but
I'd like people to eat them.
yeah. Yeah, I guess just generally, what should we do with invasive?
Yeah, if they're not poisonous, don't eat the poison hemlock, of course. But I like to hope, I mean, and you'll see in the next video, I make some comment about someday I hope somebody will find a use for one of these native plant, I mean, non-native invasive species. There is a use for it, as you'll hear, but we can't use all of it for that use. So yeah, if you're not a vegan and you don't mind just kind of leaving it out to dry if it's aquatic, or yeah, we need to control where we can, especially if it's a new introduction and we have some hope of getting the population down to zero or as close to it as possible.
Great.
Rob, you want to add something to that, or Colter?
Well, the important thing I want to add is that I once saw this cookbook for non-native species.
Oh,
So,
cool.
you know, yeah. So that is, you know, one way to do it. And you obviously do, Claire, you do all sorts of restoration projects where you pool all these non-native plants, and I've participated for a few years, and it was both fun and so much work, so difficult. So
it can be very satisfying though. So yeah, so look at Grassroots Ecology's events coming up and sign up and come help us.
Yeah, it is very satisfying, but you also see pretty quickly that it's so difficult to get rid of invasive species. Once they get established, it's almost impossible to
Well, we've
completely
had
remove them.
successes. Don't discourage people too much, because there are some
No,
clear successes we've had where all the native species have come back in and the invasives haven't. So
yeah, it does work, but in very confined spaces. So anyway, it's a long discussion, but it does work, and it's incredible to be part of it, but it's much easier if you could stop it earlier. And I studied invasive insects, where it's close to impossible to do anything once they're established. So anyway, great question.
Yeah, I'm battling some Italian thistle at my site right now, and it feels very overwhelming. I'll put a link in for some of our volunteer events if people are interested and want to pull some plants. But for right now, I'm going to turn it back to Deb. Thank you, naturalists, for answering the questions. We'll come back around for another round of question and answers, but we've got another video to watch.
All right, the next one is on trees and plants. Hope that you enjoy this one.
Here we are on the riparian corridor of Coyote Creek, just upstream from, up the bank from the creek. And we're looking at the riparian vegetation. We've got usually 3 levels of vegetation in a riparian area: the understory, the mid-level shrubs, and the trees. And in many urban areas, the trees are really what remains of native vegetation. The riparian trees provide a really important function, many really important functions. One of them is that they shade the creek, so it remains full of oxygen longer, because a cooler creek is a more oxygenated creek. Just like when you boil spaghetti and the water bubbles out, heat increases the, decreases the holding capacity of the water for oxygen. So it does that. It provides the bottom of the food chain when the leaves fall into the water. So either the creek is making its own food through photosynthesis of algae when there is sun on the water. So we need some areas where there is sun on the water, but we also need the alloplankton, is the food from the outside. But some of them I'm curious about. I know there's been studies showing eucalyptus aren't as good of a leaf for the insects in the water. And I'm very curious about bay leaves, because they are generally, there's a large bay here, and there are some stretches like the Adobe Creek in Santa Clara County where there's a lot of bay right along the creek. And it's generally it doesn't, insects do not favor bay tree because of the ketones and other strong chemicals that are in their leaves. In the distance you can see a toyon, there's often coffee berries. That kind of mid-level shrub is really important as a place to hide and a source of food for wildlife. Then the understory in a riparian ecosystem has a number of different plant species, and that's what's most damaged in urban areas. As you can see, I'm standing in a bed of Himalayan Blackberry. Fortunately, this park has a lot of our California native blackberry remaining, and we can look at the differences. So here we have the Himalayan blackberry growing over the top of a little California native blackberry, trying to eke out survival here. One nice thing about the native blackberry is it tends to let other plants grow in amongst it, whereas the Himalayan is a bully and it takes over. You can see, as I was saying, that the thorns on the Himalayan are bigger and sparser. So there's just a few along the stems. The leaflets sometimes have 3, sometimes have 5. Whereas the California native blackberry, let's look at this a little closer. Sometimes it's hard to see it has 3 because both of them tend to have the leaflets merge. So that's really 3 leaflets, but they've grown together there. When they get to be a little older, farther down the stem, more often we'll see the 3 separate leaflets. But take a look at the spines on the California blackberry. They're much more comfortable to hold on to because they're tiny little spines, and they're much more numerous and dense along the stems. You can see them down here at the base. There's just lots of little fine spines. So much more comfortable to handle than the gnarly Himalayan blackberry. So it'd be lovely someday if somebody could help rescue some of the populations here in this park. They both have edible fruit. Unfortunately, these tend to be much smaller and need more sun, I think, to get the fruit into production. So that's one reason some people feel protective of the Himalayan, because they're good eating. But they are, as I said, a bully plant of the riparian understory. So we mentioned willow as one of our native vegetations. It's a really versatile plant for using in restoration because it is very easy to root. You can cut a willow branch and stick it in the ground, and if there's enough moisture, it puts out roots. It's got a rooting hormone. So Grassroots Ecology, where I work, we have a nursery, and we take willow stakes and soak them in water, and the rooting hormone comes into the water. We can use that to help other plants get started. It also apparently, when it moves with the water, it actually can reduce friction, like the little holes on a golf ball do. So water moves through faster than without it in some cases. So some of the roughness along a creek bank can slow down the water, but apparently some of it aids in water motion. So that's pretty cool. So we have a couple of grasses in the understory. Sadly, both of these are non-native grasses, and a lot of people would be surprised to hear that this one is a grass, since it's towering about 15 feet over my head here. This is a Rundodonax, the giant reed plant, and it is the plant that is used for musical instrument reeds, but it is very invasive, and unfortunately along a creek bank it can get spread because chunks of it will break off and travel downstream and reroot the little root nodules or stolons that are moving along the ground. So we have successfully removed this from some creek banks by sawing and then covering it with tarps, or in some rare cases stump applying some herbicide. But our preference is to cover it over with tarps until it gets shaded out, and then come back and remove any regrowth that happens. So it's a tough one to work on, but it's good to get early. Like this patch would be a pretty quick job. We have also sections of the Central Valley that have acres of it, which is unfortunate. I wish we could just turn them all into musical instrument reeds, or use it for biofuel or something like that. Hopefully somebody will figure out that kind of a use. This one is Smilograph, and it reminds me a little of bamboo too, just the way it grows with very obvious nodes and branches of leaves. It's another perennial grass that's non-native. So the perennial non-natives are it's very important to get the roots out. You can't just cut the tops and expect the seed bank to go away. So you got to dig these ones up. But fortunately, they don't have a really deep root system. So they're just taking up a lot of space that our native plants would use to feed wildlife. You see very little insect damage on our non-native plants like this. And we want to see insect damage because we want to see insects, since they're an important link between the vegetation and the wildlife that lives here and eats them, like birds and frogs and snakes and fish. So go insects. All right, here we are next to riparian understory vegetation of the mid-level, which is poison oak. It's a fabulous habitat plant. Won't get too close because I'm very allergic to it. But it's a good thing to learn to identify it in the wintertime when the leaves are gone, and the leaves of 3 let it be is no longer helpful. But the branches tend to have this parabolic shape that you can see to them. They tend to have these little thumb-like projections off of them, their little branchlets. And that's one of the key characteristics. If there's a broken off branch, you can see black sap coming out. And that was actually used, and maybe still is, by some local indigenous people as tattoo ink. So you don't want to do that if you're allergic to this plant, obviously. But it's a very key characteristic is the black sap that comes out of the stems.
Okay, So this is a coastline oak. It's actually our most common oak in the Bay Area, probably. It's evergreen, so it's not deciduous like some of the other oaks. And it's incredible because it supports tons of different insects, which are food for lizards and birds and other animals, and it just creates a beautiful habitat. And I want to show you a few things that we could find on this coastline oak. So for example, I'm really interested in galls. Galls are little structures that are induced, usually by an insect, and they create basically a little shelter for that insect to reproduce. So in this case, a little wasp will lay its eggs on the leaf or the stem or a different part of the tree, and its larva will start chewing on the leaf, for example, and that will induce the creation of a gall, of a little structure where the larva will finish their entire development. And there are many different kinds, so many different species of wasps create different shapes of galls. For example, you can see this little flyer here that has many different species. There are many more. There are books that were written about galls on different host plants in California, and I highly recommend them. So this is California Bay. It's a wonderful tree because it smells so nice, and you can see that it's preparing to bloom. So it will bloom soon, I think, and then we'll have its bay nuts much later during the year. But the leaves smells fantastic. And often if you step into a forest that has many bay trees in it, you'll smell the trees. You don't even need to touch the tree for that. I love these trees. Mint, probably a non-native species. We often see them by the creek. There are a few different species you might see, but the smell is incredible. So the flowers, when they bloom, are highly attractive to pollinators. They're probably growing seeds now. Yeah, too bad you can't smell.
One day we'll have smell-o-vision.
Yeah, maybe for the next virtual event. So many of the plants you see here are non-native, but we also have some native species. Often by the creek you'd find all sorts of non-native plants, but also some great native plants. So on the other side you could see maybe toyon, which is one of our native bushes with many red berries on top, and birds love eating these berries. Okay, so I'm standing here next to some beautiful Buckeye trees. Buckeye trees are deciduous, so they dropped all their leaves. They actually do it very early, but they also sprout new leaves very early. You could actually see the buds are already here, getting ready to go. And the other thing you could see here are the Buckeye Nuts, the big seeds that already dropped to the ground. They were covered with skin or something, and then they dropped to the ground. I think they're so beautiful. Also very toxic, so they're kind of poisonous to eat. Even though the Native Americans used to cook them for a long time, for over 24 hours or so, and then you can actually eat them. But before you cook them, you could use them as something else. So they would actually put them in the creek to stun fish, so they could collect the fish and eat them. So this is the Buckeye. Most animals won't eat it, but rodents probably eat that. Okay, so we're standing here on the other side of Coyote Creek that runs down there. in an old walnut orchard. And you could see all these beautiful walnuts are now dropping their leaves, changing their colors. Probably drop all their leaves soon. So this is one, and another one. They are mixed with some of the native trees here that grow by the creek. But the cool thing about it is that these walnuts were grafted. So the European people that moved here, they grafted the European walnut that had the bigger seeds and tastier ones on top of the native walnut that was better adapted to our climate. And what you see here is a mixture, because after many, many years, sometimes the European tree died and you're left with just the native walnut, like in this case. So this is the native walnut with its small leaves, okay? And dark bark like that. And you can see some of the lighter colored bark of the European walnut that used to be there, but it seems dead at this point.
So this gorgeous tree is the western sycamore, Platanus racemosa. And this is probably one of the trees that got me inspired to study ecology. I grew up in Los Angeles and had one nearby natural area above Devil's Gate Dam near JPL in Pasadena that had beautiful sycamore trees right along the creek. And we are standing next to a gorgeous specimen. They provide lots of habitat. They have these gnarly openings and the big ones that can provide nesting spots for mammals. The bark is really flaky, and because it doesn't expand, it's not soft like some trees that crack. When the tree grows outward, it just has to exfoliate like granite in the Sierras does. So that's a very key characteristic. Now the western sycamore is different from the London plane trees that we have along the streets a lot in Santa Clara County. And part of the difference is the seed pods that hang down. There's often several of the clumps, the little balls that hang off of the tree. The leaves tend to be not as loby. Sometimes they look like a dinosaur footprint to me with 3 big lobes, but sometimes they have more. And one problem we're seeing is that there's the London plane tree, which is a hybrid of the American occidentalis and the Asian, which is orientalis. That hybrid is used for street trees because they grow straighter. They don't provide the sprawling habitat, which I loved as a kid because it was easy to climb. They also tend to hang over creeks and then they fall in and provide good large woody debris, which we know we need for fish habitat and other purposes, functions of the stream corridor. So they're starting to hybridize. So we're worried that that's going to change the genetics of our western sycamores and have changed the properties that they give the riparian ecosystem in California. So there's efforts to try and grow only the California or the western sycamore, Platanus racemosa. So there's our nursery has been helping with an effort to clone through cutting, so we know we're getting pure DNA of western sycamore. So fortunately these days we can do genetic tests to look for how much of any of the hybrid might be in a particular plant. So we find the ones that are pure racemosa and clone them and plant them out in areas to make sure we choose different cuttings so that we're getting some genetic diversity that way.
All right, thank you. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. And this time we can take some questions. Do we have any, Hannah, in the chat? And if people would like, they could turn their videos on and go to gallery mode.
There was a question about Jerusalem crickets, and there is a North American Jerusalem cricket, and I'm assuming that's the one we're seeing here that is native to California. I made a comment in the video about the little aquatic isopods being non-native, and now I'm not so sure because it's possible that it's the, what was the name of it? It's the Oregon seapill or something like that. It's got a long kind of complicated name that starts with a GN. I'll put it in the chat. But it'd be lovely if it's that one. They're unusual in fresh water. They're usually in brackish water. So there's a lot of observations on INAT around the bay and in the ocean, the coastal sides. But our CalNat alumna Chloe Van Loon found one in Pescadero Creek, pretty high up in the hills, which is unusual. One of the people who specialize in them was very surprised that she had found it there. So who knows how that blood got there, but as I said, I'm suspicious that the ones in Coyote Creek are coming from the Delta. I think it would be really a fascinating study for somebody to look into, but one of you young people go to school and study these little aquatic isopods. They're pretty fun.
Thanks, Claire. We answered quite a few of the questions in the chat. One that I see wasn't answered yet is about how to identify toyon berries from the red berries we see, the other ones. My quick thought is about size of clumps of berries and also looking at the leaves of the plant. Toyon has some pretty distinctly serrated leaves that some of the other maybe berry lookalikes don't have. But any other tips that you have, Claire or Colter?
One thing that I like doing with toyons is that you take a leaf and you rub it really hard like this. It don't always work, but you try a few of them if it doesn't, and give it a sniff. And if you smell almond, you know you've got to, don't do it with something with 3 leaves. But with little tooth leaves, sometimes it can be hard to tell a coffee berry from a toyon. I think those are the hardest to tell apart. Most of the ones with red berries that aren't native, which most of the ones with red berries that aren't toyon are non-native, like the cotoneaster and the what's the one that causes the birds to crash into the... Say it again.
Pyracantha.
Pyracantha, yes. So most of them have very different leaves than the toyon. So just take a good look at a toyon leaf, but then also give it a rub and sniff it. So there's cyanide in the leaves. There's also cyanide in the fruit, but as they ripen, it gets concentrated in the seeds. So if you want to try toyon cider, which is usable, read about it carefully, but my understanding is you want to sieve out the seeds and cook it because the cyanide is going to volatilize